March the 29th, 1983. Here's the first chapter of the story that is not worth telling. I was born at Little Bridge, Florida, a community that doesn't exist anymore. Under a leaking roof. When it rained, they had to set buckets and pots on the beds to keep them dry. Miss Martha Weeks, a neighbor lady, was the midwife. My mother's name was Nettie. Her birth date was December the 19th, 1880. She died in 1955. Her father's name was William Hardy. He was born August the 12th, 1876. Died in 1949. Brothers, Larry, only one brother. Two sisters, Lori and Elgie. Birth date not known. I happen to have the good fortune of being born into a very poor, yet a very honest family. Hard-working, and not much success in making incomes. So, times was hard from the earliest time of my memory. I remember my mother made our beds out of moss. She'd dry the moss on the fence or a wire line, and then beat it up and make it into mattresses. And ever so often that'd get as hard as a board, and she'd take it out and fluff it up and put it back. We'd have a new and a fresh bed. The sheets was made out of sackcloth. Back then lots of different things came in sacks, made out of white cloth. So the sheets was made out of sacks, pillow slips, and our underwear was mostly made out of flour sacks. Back in them days, some flour came in 24-pound bags. And I was, I imagine 8 or 9 years old before I got a pair of shoes. I remember me and Larry got them at the same time. His was blue. I don't remember mine, little button shoes, I think. And so, we worked hard as little children in the fields with Papa and Mama. Hoped to tend to the things, like back then we pinned cattle to get the ground rich enough we could plant sweet potatoes, sugar cane on it, pin them up of the evening, keep them shut up overnight, sort them out the next day and turn the cows one way and the calves the other. So, that's the way, kinda, that we got along. There was no schools in our community, so I was 9 years old before about 8 or 10 kids was in the community that was of school age, and the school system started a one-teacher school in an old house that nobody lived in. The first teacher's name was Luella Dawsey. The first year, and the next year the teacher's name was Anime Baggett. And went to school there 2 years. In 1918, when the armistice was signed in World War I, we was in the vicinity of several phosphate mines, and they started blowing them whistles about 10 o'clock that morning, and they were still blowing at noon. So the teacher told us that the war must be over and we could go home for the day. So that was to home we went. And that was the end of the Great War. But it didn't help our situation any. We still was from hand to mouth. Back in them days, what you didn't grow and put in the barn or in the smokehouse or the syrup house, you just about didn't have. And if it ran out, you was just out until the next crop or the next time when you could kill hogs or get something to eat by harvest. Long when I was, maybe 12, 14 years old, my dad began to drink alcohol. And he became an alcoholic. Never was a better man to his neighbors and friends or his family when he was sober, and he was about as bad a one when he got drunk, especially to the family. So a lot of nights when he was on one of them tears, my mother'd take us kids and go to the woods, and we'd camp out all night. And sometimes he'd go 6 months or longer without a drink, usually when he didn't have nothing to buy it with. We'd make a crop and get a little money. About the first thing would happen, he'd get on one. And then everything that we got nearly out of the crop, he'd throw it away. And that kept us flat from 1 year to the next. So we just moved along as best we could. We had a good family of his brothers and sisters and his mother, and we had considerable strength in the family. Well, time came later that it got big enough that I wanted a job. And by that time, well, there just wasn't many jobs. And for an old boy that had grown up in the country and didn't know nothing, there wasn't any jobs. So I just went along as best I could. Helped my parents sharecropping on the farm. Sometimes we'd rent some land, sometimes sharecrop. Till I got, I guess close to 20 years old. And since I couldn't get a job, I couldn't make a dime, no way, I decided I'd join the Army. About as bad a thing as an old dumb boy could do then. They was paying $21 a month, and they took out $1.75 a month for your laundry. And I made my parents an assignment of $10. That left me $9.25 for the month. Well, I got in the service, and I thought was doing right well, but I didn't like it. And they put in to get me out. So they finally got an affidavit signed and got it into the office of the headquarters, and I got a discharge. I came home on the October the 30th, 1928. And my daddy was on Ruby's daddy's place sharecropping strawberries. And her daddy was fixing to go to the Everglades on a trapping, hunting trip. So the first thing I done was to help him get ready, and off to the Everglades we went, and we didn't come back till Christmas. We got, I must have been 50 or 60 coon hides and cat hides and possum hides to sell. We packed them up and shipped them off, and we didn't get hardly anything for them. I don't remember what the old man got, but I remember he gave me $5 for about 5 or 6 weeks that we stayed in them woods. Well, by that time the strawberries was in, and I hooked my parents, picking strawberries and hauling them off, planting the spring crop. And Ruby then was 16 or 17 years old, and me and her got to slipping around of a night and dating a little. First thing you know, we decided to get married. And one night, we went down to the old man and old lady's house and told them. The old man was sitting at the end of the dining table, and all the remark he made was that that's a hell of a note, and that's the kind of permission that we got. But anyway, on March the 6th of 1929, we was married by Uncle Ben, an elder of mine. Well, then I continued on with my parents. And me and her lived with them in the little tenant house on her daddy's farm. And we worked the spring crop and finally got through with that about the middle of the summer. There wasn't any job, but I finally got one at the phosphate pit. I worked down there. I don't remember what that price of that was, but probably about 20 or 25 cents an hour. I didn't stay there very long. We lived in a house there at Brewster where we were working for that company. Got laid off. Well, my parents by that time had got on a place down there at Fort Meade. So I went down there and stayed with them a few days. And I tried to get a job where Larry was working, him and Wiley Rivers. And finally the man told me, he says, I'll give you $1.75 a day for 10 hours to hoe railroad track. So I was hoeing railroad track at $1.75 a day for 10 hours when Alan was born. And when he was born, he went to crying. And it seemed like he never would quit. When I'd work all day and come home, and then he'd want to squall all night. And I just thought I couldn't stand it. But anyhow, me and him made peace and got along pretty good. Got along pretty good. That sort of takes you roughly from the time I was born until Alan was born.
Prayer life for Jesus' sake. Amen. Here now is Reverend Hutchins.
This will be part 2 of chapter 1. Soon after Alan was born, I got all the railroad track, Pembroke phosphate mine, hoed. And I got laid off. And there was no other jobs. So I managed to get place across the river to farm on. Had a pretty good house on it, and a small orange grove, and some pretty good land. I got the use of the entire place for keeping the grove up. Well, that would have been in the fall of 1930. So I got some strawberry plants and got out about an acre of berries for that winter. And they done right well. They made pretty good berries, and they sold pretty fair. Made a little money. That put me into the spring of 1931. So I farmed a little that spring, did it very well, had some eggplants, and made one picking of about 40 crates one time and shipped them to Baltimore, Maryland, and got a bill back for the freight. So that fall, I put out a little bigger berry patch, about 2 acres. And they made pretty good berries, but you couldn't sell them. I mean, you could sell them, but sell them very cheap, 5 or 6 cents a pint. So you could hardly live on what you got out of them. Didn't make any money, but during the harvest of that berry crop, I got out about an acre of tomatoes. Growed a pretty tomato crop. They really made good tomatoes, and you couldn't sell them. I finally picked about 25 old orange field crates full of tomatoes and got my neighbor, Barney Bass, in his 1-ton Model A truck to haul them to Plant City. Couldn't get a bid on them. Late that evening, a man offered me $5 for the load. I sold the load for the $5 and gave Barney, the man that hauled them up there, the $5. So that was some kind of hard way to go. By that time, I was on the rocks. We had a crate mill a few miles over there that was buying hardwood. That's black gum and sweet gum that grows down in the swamps. So me and another neighbor, Barney Stokes, decided that we would try the block business. And all the rest of that fall and winter, that would have been 31 into 32. We cut blocks down in the swamp, snaked them out with a horse up on the hill, and I bought an old Model A truck with a flat body on it, on credit, to haul them blocks to that crate mill. And we worked at that. Oh, I don't know, maybe 12 to 18 months. Never done as hard a work in my life, cutting them trees down in them swamps and cutting them up in about 8-foot blocks, getting them on the hill and then loading them by hand on that truck. Well, we could barely make a living. So, stayed with that till about the end of 1932. And in December of 1932, Fred was born. And there just wasn't any way to continue on that place without any money. And Ruby's daddy was living on his farm at Bradley Junction by himself. His wife had died. So we loaded up the kids and what little stuff we had on that Model A truck and moved it over there to Bradley Junction. And by the way, the old truck wasn't paid for, and it wasn't but a little while before the man I bought it from come got it. Well, that put us over there without any money, and we picked strawberries that winter, and they were real sorry berries, for 1.50 cents a quart. And when I wasn't picking berries, I was applying that old man's crop. I laid off about 40 acres of ground for corn and peas, planted it, and cultivated it all that summer. And he let me have a little piece of ground big enough to put 1,000 nursery strawberry plants on. So I managed to get enough money to get them plants and set them out. And along in the summer, he sold that place. And that put me with nowhere to go. But the man that bought it said I could continue to stay there if I'd work the grove there and set him out about 10 acres more grove for the use of the place, the old house to live in and the land to farm. And when he sold the place, the horse the old man had went with it, so he let me keep the horse. That fall, I set out 350 new orange trees for him. I got enough plants to set out 1 acre of berries. And they made pretty good berries. And they sold a little better. So I got a little bit of money out of that berry patch. And the next spring, that would have been the very first part, or that would have been in about the middle of 1933. We went out there to the old man's place on the first day of February 1933. So then I started to planting corn and peas, growing strawberries, and went and cleared 2 acres of new ground on a neighbor's place up there about 1/2 mile from the house. A lot of pine trees and stumps. We dug them out. I had an old nigger to help me and cleared that land. At that time, new land was the ideal thing for a strawberry nursery plant bed. So I set it out. After we got it cleared and the land cleaned up, set it out in plants in the spring of, I guess that'd have been about 34, or maybe 35. So I was doing my very best. I thought maybe that I could sell. A lot of times you could sell several $100s worth of strawberry plants if you had good plants in the fall of the year to people that didn't have no plants. But anyway, I figured that I growed about 1 million plants on that 2 acres. Never sold the first plant. Well, didn't have any money to put in another strawberry crop. So I went to my old neighbor, old man Doc Durrance, and got $150 to spend on labor to set 4 acres of double road berries. Well, that taken all the money that I had about, and when they should have started to growing, they started getting littler. And I was never had experienced such a thing in my life. Every leaf that came out on the plant would be smaller than the last one that came out. Well, nobody knew what the problem was. Later on, I learned that it was nematode, which is very commonly known now, and they know how to treat them. But back then, nobody knew what it was. And so, out of all of that work, growing that plant bed, setting out that 4 acres of double road berries, never picked a strawberry. It just was a complete flop. And there we was on the pig again. Ruby went to Mulberry one day and come back with 100 biddies. Old Roscoe Davidson had talked her into buying. And he talked us into starting to raise friars. We could raise friars and sell them and maybe make a little money. So we bought another 100 and another one. I don't know, maybe got up to 400 or 500. And did very well with them. Had an awful time of keeping them warm in the winter. But in a way we did. And I made 2 or 3 trips around peddling friars to the stores. Bartow and Mulberry and Fort Meade. Picked up a little bit of money. One Sunday morning we went to church over in Mulberry. And we went home. We went to old man Alec Evers's for dinner that day. He lived there in Mulberry, and after church we went with them for dinner. And they came up one of those high wind spring type storms, and I had the chickens I had houses for them with doors on them and a runway out in the front so they could run around but could get them back in the house overnight and shut them up. And that storm, that morning while we was over there at church, blowed them doors to on them houses, and them chickens piled up against the wall and drowned it. I came home that afternoon, and there they was, maybe 200 or 300 head of them, getting up pretty good sized chickens, drowned it. Taking an old bean hamper and taking me 3 or 4 hours to tote them chickens off and throw them over the fence about 200 or 300 yards from the house. So that wound up the chicken business. So that'll end part 2 of chapter 1. This will be part 1 of chapter 2. In the early part of 1937, when I could no longer proceed with a farming operation, I was desperate to find some kind of a job. A man that was a great friend of mine by the name of Arthur Kirkland had been the manager of the Plant City store for Badcock. He had retired and moved out to the farm and lived near where I lived. He knew how desperate my situation was, and he saw Mr. Badcock one day and recommended that if he had any place to hire a man to give me a job. And when I seen him, he told me that Mr. Badcock said to go see him. So I went. He put me to work in the warehouse. I worked there a week, about as hard a work as I ever done, and he laid me off. The following Monday morning, I went back to his store and asked him if he had anything else. He asked me, he said, "Do you reckon you could sell furniture?" Well, I said, "I don't know, sir, but I'd sure try." He called the garage and had them to rig me up a small truck, carried me across the railroad where he had second-hand furniture, and told me a little about it and how to read the prices. Had some of it put on that truck, and I started out to go to Plant City to see if I could sell furniture. And on the way there, I passed a little log house on the curve of the road, and I thought, well, that looks like maybe a place that I could stop and talk to him. So I stopped, and the man came out on the porch, and I gave him a little story. And he said, "Well, we know where the store is. If we need anything, we'll go get it." Well, that nipped me in the bud. I got back in the truck and went on to Plant City. I was sure then that I couldn't sell furniture. But I went on to Plant City. Having his truck, I figured I'd make the day some way. So I got down in the black part of town, and a woman was washing clothes out in the backyard, and a colored woman, and I asked her if she needed some bedding. She said, "Yes, I sure do." So I put into talking to her, and at that time we could sell a mattress for nothing down if we got the old mattress. So she bought my mattresses, and I picked up her old mattresses and had to tie them up in the bags that they was in to keep all the stuff from spilling out. I got rid of my little bit of furniture and headed back to Mulberry, tickled to death to tell Mr. Badcock that I'd sold out. He said, "Well, what did you come back for?" I said, "This is the best time of the day now. People will be coming home. You could have kept on selling furniture." Well, that concluded my day. I went home and back the next day, and I sold a little more. And it wasn't but 2 or 3 days. He's paying me 5% commission. About the 3rd or 4th day, I made nearly $15 that day. Well, that's as much as he'd paid me for a week's work in the warehouse. So when I got through that day, I went back where Larry lived. He was living over there at Medella. Had a job with a phosphate company running a little old pumping station about 3 days a week, making about as much maybe in a week as I'd made that day. So I went and told him my good fortune, how much money I'd made that day. And he said, you reckon he would give me a job? Well, I said, I don't know, but I'll ask him. So the next day, when I started to get up my truckload of furniture, I said to Mr. Badcock as we walked across from the store to the warehouse, if he had a place that he could give Larry a job. He said, you reckon he'd be a good man? I said, I think he'd be as good a one as you ever hired. He said, I just don't have any place to put one, but he says, tell him to come to see me. So Larry went to see him, and he put him to work. Gave him an armload of calendars and a tack box full of tacks and a tack hammer, and told him to put up a calendar in everybody's house in Bartow. Well, on I went with my selling, making a little bit of money. Wasn't long before he decided that maybe I would be good enough that he'd buy me a house trailer and hook it up to an automobile, fill it full of furniture, and he put sounding equipment in it, microphones and a record machine to play music, put big signs on the car and the trailer, and I was to take that from town to town and street to street. Drive up and down the street, playing the music, making announcements, stopping on corners somewhere and let the women come out and go through the stock that I had in the trailer and take their orders. So that worked pretty good. I'd sell for 2 or 3 days, and then I'd go and give him the orders, and he'd load up a truck and send it in there, and I'd go with him to deliver. And he gave me 10% then with that deal. And I owed $1,700 when I left the farm, completely busted and that far in debt, which was a fortune then. And in about 7 or 8 months, I made enough of money on that job to pay every dollar that I owed. I sold in Brooksville, in Dade City first, and then I came back and sold around in Mulberry around the store. And then he sent me to Bradenton, Sarasota, Manatee. I must have stayed down there about 3 months, pulling that trailer, selling furniture every day. I worked that country out pretty thoroughly, and then he sent me to Belglade, Pahokee, Canal Point, Okeechobee. And I did the same thing down there for about, well, maybe 3 months. So I was in the furniture business. About that time, he decided that maybe he would stop that scheme of selling in the territory where the branch stores were. They didn't seem to take too well to him sending somebody into their territory and selling them a bunch of accounts. So he pulled me off of that and put me to special collector. Had accounts scattered all over Florida and as far away as Georgia and Alabama. He seemed to always have plenty of them and a little bit of knowledge about where they were. And I took his truck and started hunting them accounts. And some of them I could find and some I couldn't. Some of them would let me have the merchandise and some wouldn't. Actually made one or two replevies way back there. And that went on. I don't know now just how many weeks or months, but finally he sent me to Fort Myers. The store down there had a debit that was just in terrible shape. World of lost accounts, and a lot of them that wasn't paying. And he sent me down there to clean that place up. Mr. Tillis was the store manager. I must have stayed down there 2 months. Never seen such a mess in them cane fields and them nigger camps in the cane fields scattered all over the U.S. Sugar Company's farms and dairy farms and just anywhere that the man that had been working that route could unload something, he'd unload. And I pulled it and rented a warehouse. Hauled it in there and piled it up in that warehouse until I could get a van load, and then each send the truck down and pick it up. So as I worked that route, finally having about completed it, Mr. Tillis wanted me to come down and go to work for him. Well, that was something new. I'd leave my home country and go to Fort Myers. I come home and talked to Ruby about it, and she wanted to go. The result was that I talked to Mr. Babcock, and it was okay with him. So I went to Fort Myers and went to work with Mr. Tillis. And he put me on a route, working all the way from Fort Myers to LaBelle, several sawmills around Fort Myers, several sawmills around LaBelle, and one big sawmill at Felden, on down to Immokalee, and there's 3 or 4 sawmills in that country. So I really had a big job on my hands. That route went all the way to Everglades City, and back by Naples, Bonita Springs, and back to Fort Myers. And I worked every day, 6 days a week. Barely made enough to get by. I guess by that time, well, yeah, Bernard had been born in September while I was working out of Mulberry the year before. So we had the 3 boys. And in December of 1938, which would have been the first year I was in Fort Myers, Ed was born. So there I was with $25 a week and a family of 6. But somehow or another we got by and made it work. That will be the end of part 1 of chapter 2.